Let's begin in Syria, 12 days since a revolution and the toppling of the Assad regime that began with a lightning offensive 12 days before that. The new de facto leaders of the country, HTS, have been meeting with US officials today. The group leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, formerly Abu Mohammed al-Jalani, appears to be hosting an open-door policy to foreign leaders right now as international governments that had labelled them as terrorists decide whether to lift sanctions and lift the label. With it, a decision needs to be made too by the Americans, or perhaps it's a technicality now that they are in Damascus, but on lifting the $10 million reward for the arrest of Mr. al-Sharaa. Well, joining me in the studio is William Jordan, former US retired diplomat who's previously served in the Middle East and in North Africa, including in the Middle East in Syria. Great to have you on the programme this evening. Also with us, Doug Herbert, our International Affairs editor. As we've seen for the last 11 days, there is a lot to discuss. William, starting with you, talk us through what you think American expectations are from this meeting.
I think right now it's mostly a kind of a getting to know you sort of conversation. There had apparently been some preliminary contacts, and it's not even clear where they took place immediately following the fall of Damascus to the rebels. But this is more, I think, focused on the concrete realities, kind of like what the French did a few days ago, of figuring out whether the situation in Damascus in particular would warrant the return of U.S. diplomats to go back to the embassy there and to restart the process of diplomatic relations with Syria, which had been broken since 2012. So I think that's the first order of business. The second order of business is to sort of run through a list of things that I hope is not going to be too binding or be perceived by the folks in Damascus as starting a list of requirements from the U.S. But I do think that given the HTS background and leadership, that the U.S. needs to put some markers on the table as far as their previous or possibly current jihadist credentials, and to try to get some sense of where the new leadership wants to take Syria in the reconciliation, we hope, process, as well as the restoration of some new kind of government or the establishment of some sort of new government in Syria.
To that end, the idea of a establishment of some sort of government in Syria, the information we're getting from AP agency in the last half an hour or so suggests, well, the officials quoted suggesting that they want to see, quote, a transitional government that works, quote, for democracy, and they've talked about ISIS, which you also raised. Can we link the two together, given that 24 hours previously, we're only just finding out about events that the Americans appear to have taken out two senior IS leaders there?
Well, I think on the first part of that, in terms of what kind of, or what the hopes, and I stress the hopes the U.S. would see framing the process of, creating a new government in Syria, that we're not using words like democracy, that we're probably using, I hope we're using words like good governance and representation, so that we're not, trying to impose a sort of a Western framework on Syria. But I think that the idea of underscoring that what we would not want to see in Syria is a sort of fundamentalist Islamist regime that would be making life difficult for women, that would be imposing Sharia law even on non-Muslim communities, and that the ultimate form of government would be something that would allow for the participation of as broad a swath of the Syrian population to approve whenever it's finally ready. And as well as hoping that there is a measure of rule of law, and that what we have seen is the miraculous sort of calm in Syria continues while all of this plays out. As far as the IS element of it is concerned, I think there's no question that what has just happened and what continues to happen and what will continue to happen, certainly as long as U.S. troops are in Syria, is, in terms of the ongoing anti-Islamic State military operations by the U.S. and others, we need to talk to the new leadership. We need to find out, in fact, if they are something other than, either or see how they are as far as being reformed jihadists and whether there remain any sympathies to the Islamic State. So that will probably be one of the most serious conversations that I think the group in Damascus will be having, in part because that will set the stage for however things might ultimately play out between Kurds and this new government in Damascus in terms of the northeastern part of the country. And I return always to the point that one of the primary American concerns will be the fate of the thousands of detainees being held by the Kurds up in that area, who we will not want to see, whatever the sympathies of the current government of Damascus, sort of released into the wild.
And we're talking about, Doug, something like 10,000 ISIS prisoners in the northeast. Also interesting, Doug, what William just said there, US advising, don't use terms like democracy just now. And for Ahmed al-Sharaa, there's kind of, to talk us through a flip reverse, not what the Americans perhaps want from this, but what you think the Syrian de facto leaders are now probably looking from the Americans.
Well, they're trying to, get as much as they can. They're right now in the paramount position. Obviously, this thing is still playing out. We don't know how things are going to end up ultimately. For now, they are the go-to interlocutors. They're the ones who seem to be calling the shots. But like you said, there's a lot of different factions and skirmishes and different geopolitical delicate maneuverings going on among various powers, some more dominant, some less dominant, some winners in the region, some losers in the region. It is still very much a geopolitical game of, pickup sticks. And yes, HTS right now obviously sees itself as the group everyone wants to speak to, right? It's not just the Americans showing up. Sure, they haven't been there in a little over a decade formally in this capacity, a diplomatic delegation, but we've had everyone trying to open channels of communication with them, it seems. The French have reached out, the Germans have been reaching out, the UN has sent emissaries, the Russians, who are perceived as being on the losing end of this equation, even if Putin didn't acknowledge it as such yesterday, Iran, also, all of them now making noises in favor of trying to talk to these people, no matter what they may actually think of them in private. This perceived necessity, this is the group, for better or for worse, that you have to speak to. We even heard the head of the International Labor Organization today, an American as well, basically saying the sanctions, saying the international community, put aside your personal feelings and your ideological stance with regard to this group that is now meeting with the delegation. Sanctions should be lifted for the good of Syria's stability going forward. So yeah, very much there's an effort, and it seems, a very deliberate effort not to sort of put your thumb on the scale by using these sort of loaded terms. Democracy could be considered one of them, a loaded term, and to speak in terms more of inclusivity, moderation. I will note that this group, the delegation we were just speaking about, wasn't just meeting with HTS, right? They also had on their agenda meetings, reach-out sessions with civic society, members of civic society, members of minority group. Remember, it's a patchwork mosaic, Syria, many different communities there, and also representatives, women's rights representatives, females representatives. So there's been a lot of different sort of, shuttle diplomacy going on. Obviously, the meetings with this HTS group are, top of the agenda, perhaps the most important in their inbox in this mission. But it doesn't mean to say that the very fact they're trying to reach out and meet with all these other groups isn't in and of itself sending the message, a very strong message, as to what America would like to see as this situation continues to unfold.
Given what Doug just said, William, in your experience of things going wrong in Libya and of things in Syria, knowing the ground there, when you look at 12 days ago, we were seeing this group literally on the road to Damascus. Now we're seeing the leader who appears over the years to have this Damascene conversion from being in prison at one point with al-Baghdadi, the former ISIS leader, to becoming more moderate. We just saw an image a moment ago when he was sitting down for this one big BBC interview with Jeremy Bowen, one of my former colleagues, where he talked about rights for minorities. He was asked a question, wasn't he, as well, what about alcohol? To which he said, that's not for me to answer, kind of said that's for the others. So my question to you is, are you hopeful that we are seeing signs of a path towards a workable government internationally?
I'm always cautious about either expressing optimism or hope anymore when it comes to the region. But yeah, I think that he's saying all the right things. And let's remember, the world has a long history of once radical rebel leaders taking over taking over governments and having to basically moderate or deal with the realities of governance. So far, as I think I said earlier, things seem calm. I mean, almost remarkably calm. What I worry about is either the one big horrible event, and you mentioned Libya. I think here I'm probably more inclined to use the Iraq analogy after 2003, the American invasion, where one horrendously violent thing could happen, such as then the bombing of the UN headquarters, or just sort of a series of things that we're beginning to hear about from international media that are now fanning out in Syria and are finally revealing, minor cases of revenge killings and actions taken against people who are considered to be close to the regime. If that becomes a pattern, right now it's very sporadic and it seems to be very limited, and it seems as though the folks under HTS's guidance, I won't say they're under HTS's authority, have been trying to keep them under control. As long as it continues the way that it is, I mean, I think there's a reason to be hopeful. I don't know because we know very little about this man. We don't know where Ahmed al-Sharaa actually comes out in terms of wanting to deal with countries like the United States that imprisoned him at Camp Bucca in Iraq for so long, or whether others around him are in full agreement. The actual configuration and makeup of this coalition that came to power is still extremely unknown. And in fact, one of the obvious questions that I have is the delegation in Damascus, the American delegation in Damascus, with whom are they meeting in the leadership? And how will those ongoing discussions and possible dialogue play out? So,
to the extent,
not Ahmed al-Sharaa. They're not meeting with the top guy, apparently.
Okay.
At least according to the initial reports.
Well, perhaps also, maybe we take away from optics matter there as well for who Ahmed al-Sharaa is seen to meet. We'll just see what comes out as they continue to meet into the evening. Also mention as well, another aspect to this, Turkey. The Turkish foreign minister in the past few hours is speaking to France 24's Mark Perelman. Let's take a listen.
Certainly, we are not in favor of any bases remaining in Syria, not only the Russians, but any others. So
they should leave.
Well, I mean, it will be up to Syrian people. It will be up to Syrian people, and if they come to an understanding, it's their decision. So we'll see it. But now, as we see it, the Russians now in the process of redeploying their units. And in the end of the process, we don't know how much of them will continue to stay in Syria, in the bases.
Very interesting on Russia there, particularly. So the Turkish view is that they've been told to leave. Now, what we saw, footage of this kind of orderly queue of Russian vehicles leaving, tanks. However, there's been no obvious call from the government to Russia to publicly leave. That's key.
For now, in fact, just the opposite. For now, the indications are that they are not going to, touch those Russian bases. They're going to leave them there. But we do know that the ships themselves, the Russian ships that have been at the naval base at Tartus, are now anchored offshore. So they're not actually in the port themselves. They've sort of taken their distance. You spoke about some of those convoys that have been, seen in satellite images, moving in various directions. There have been reports. Some have been going to Libya, to sort of re-hub and set up a new sort of transit hub for also Russian interests in the Sahel region of Africa, i.e. the former stomping ground of Prigozhin's Wagner group. But what's interesting here, just with the dynamic with Turkey and Russia, the simplistic reductionist sort of take is that, they've been adversaries in the region. They have this on-off love-hate relationship. We remember several years back when they had that giant falling out over the Turkey shooting at a Russian jet fighter. And that led to months of sanctions and basically a meltdown in relations between Turkey and Russia. But at the end of the day, if we look at it from circa end of 2024, the political relationship relationship, yes, is always a little troublesome, but it's sort of trumped, excuse the pun, overridden by the economic relationship. And they do have very strong ties. Let's not, forget, whether we're talking about natural gas, whether we're talking about the fact that, Russia's right now building Turkey's first nuclear plant in the south of the country. They have a lot of interwoven, intricate ties, and I think they're both sort of, in that sense, these are two leaders who, for all of their maybe adversarial relationship in the past, they also have a sort of admiration, respect for each other. They're not an admiration society for each other, but I think they understand each other and they understand how each in his own way is basically watching his own back. So I think in that sense, what we hear Turkey saying about Russia, I think that relationship, at least economically, is going to remain relatively strong. I do think Turkey, for itself, is maneuvering, obviously, to be the dominant player in the post-Assad Syria. We've heard it today with the statements. It wants to be really involved in building the state structures and even writing a new constitution for Syria, being right up there at the table.
Very interesting, Doug. Thank you, Doug Herbert, our International Affairs editor. William Jordan as well, retired US diplomat, as I said, who spent a lot of time in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you both.